Hello students, welcome to biology class. This video is in continuity with the previous video of chapter genetics. The objectives that we are covering in this video are observation and laws postulated by Mendel, law of dominance, law of segregation, law of independent assortment. Starting with Mendelism. Mendelian inheritance or Mendelian genetics or Mendelism is a set of primary principles relating to the transmission of hereditary characteristics from parent organisms to their offspring. The laws of inheritance were derived by Gregor Mendel, a 19th century monk conducting hybridization experiments in garden peas, Pisum sativum. Between 1856 and 1863, he cultivated and tested some 28,000 pea plants. From these experiments, he deduced two generalizations that later known as Mendel's law of heredity or Mendelian inheritance. Mendel, after a tireless or ceaseless experimentation on sweet pea plant, made certain observations and postulated the following three laws, which are known as laws of inheritance: law of dominance, law of segregation, law of independent assortment. Starting with law of unit character. According to this law, each character in an individual is controlled by a pair of factors or genes, out of which one is shared by male parent and one is shared by female parent. Every character, when transmitted from parents to young ones, is a unit and independent to the inheritance of other characters. Two factors controlling one character in an individual may be similar, known as homozygous, or dissimilar, known as heterozygous. It is called principle of paired factors. Now discussing the first law of inheritance, law of dominance. It states that in heterozygous condition, out of the two contrasting alleles, one expresses itself morphologically and the other remains unexpressed. The factor or allele which expresses itself phenotypically in the presence of its contrasting allele is called dominant, and the other, which remains unexpressed, is called recessive. Mendel postulated this law based upon his monohybrid crosses. For example, when a pure tall plant is crossed with dwarf plant, the whole of the progeny is tall. It means gene for tallness T is dominant over gene for dwarfness small t. Next is law of segregation. It states that the two factors or genes controlling one character separate or segregate without blending or mixing with each other during the formation of gametes, so that each gamete receives one factor or gene for each character. It means gametes are always pure, hence it is also known as law of purity of gametes. Mendel postulated this law based upon his monohybrid crosses. He crossed a pure tall plant with a dwarf plant. Then there is gamete formation and then the fertilization, and then the F1 generation produced was all tall plant. On selfing the F1 plants. Selfing means crossing the breeds of individual obtained in F1 generation. F2 generation is raised. In this image, we can see on selfing the F1 plant, the F2 generation produced consisting of 75% of tall and 25% of dwarf plants. That is in the ratio 3:1. Now, the result of these monohybrid crosses gives phenotypic ratio 3:1 and genotypic ratio 1:2:1. From the above F2 generation, which is produced on selfing of F1 generation, it is clear that 25% progeny is dwarf. These dwarf plants are possible from the F1 tall plant only if the gene for dwarfness segregates or separates from the gene for tallness. Gene for tallness does not blend or mix with the gene for dwarfness when present simultaneously. Phenotypically dominant individual may be homozygous, that is capital T, or heterozygous, capital T small t. But recessive plants are always homozygous, that is small t for that character. Law of independent assortment. It takes place when there are two or more pairs of contrasting characters. It states that the factors or genes controlling different characters assort independently without influencing each other during the formation of gametes. Mendel explained this law on the basis of his dihybrid crosses. In such cases, Mendel considered the inheritance of two different characters simultaneously. For this, the first character is the shape of the seed, may be round or wrinkled. Next character is the color. The color of the seed may be yellow or green. Round and yellow seed are dominant and wrinkled and green seeds are recessive. Now, he took two pure breeding plants, one having round and yellow seeds and other wrinkled and green seeds. On crossing, F1 generation was raised in which all the plants producing had round and yellow seeds. By selfing the F1 plants, when F2 generation was raised, he found four combinations in the following ratio. These are round and yellow seeds, round and green seeds, wrinkled and yellow seeds, and wrinkled and green seeds. F2 genotypes are very complex and F2 phenotypes are 9:3:3:1. These are the hybrid ratios in F2 generation. The two kinds of ratios in the F2 generation for monohybrid and dihybrid crosses are monohybrid ratio in F2 generation. Phenotypic ratio is 3:1 and genotypic ratio is 1:2:1. Dihybrid ratios in F2 generation. Phenotypic ratio 9:3:3:1. Genotypic ratio is 1:2:1:2:4:2:1:2:1. Moving on to the next topic, hereditary traits in humans. Though human beings are unique, there are a set of common characteristics that we all share with the members of our family, with our peers, etc. We possess a unique set of traits. While some traits are governed by genes which are inherited from parents to the offsprings, there are traits that are acquired through observing, learning, and most of which are determined by a combination of environmental factors and genes. Now, these are some selected hereditary traits in humans. Character: skin pigment. Normal is dominant and recessive is albinism. Eyes color: Brown is dominant. Blue or gray is recessive. Ear, normal is dominant and deafness is recessive. Earlobe, free is dominant and attached is recessive. Lips, broad, dominant and recessive, thin. Tongue, ability to roll and inability to roll is recessive. Hand, right-handed is dominant and left-handed is recessive. RH factor, positive, dominant and negative, recessive. Color vision, dominant, normal and color blindness, recessive. Hair, curly, dominant, straight, recessive. In this image, we can see the different hereditary traits in the humans that we acquire from the parents. At the last, some uncommon hereditary traits. Polytectile is a condition in which a person is born with extra fingers or toes. Ambidactyly is a medical condition that causes one or more fingers to be permanently bent. Person is unable to straighten the small finger. Thank you so much.